Hello, and welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly, with me, your host, Joe Vandervoort. This month, we're lucky to be joined in the studio by the writer and architect Karl Sharro, who, along with a panel of World Right volunteers, will be discussing the current conflict in Gaza. Karl, would you like to take us through what you think are the key issues?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is an opportunity for us to all start thinking about politics more seriously and how it affects our lives. I understand that these are particularly emotive times, and seeing the media coverage of the situation might make people more emotive about the subject, but there is still an opportunity here to look and say there is a chance for us to look at an alternative way of dealing with politics. And I think what happens normally is, under, if you like, the intensity of the situation, that people tend to reduce an aspect of a conflict that's somehow removed from our lives into black and white issues, and we tend to oversimplify it. And the media encourages us to think about it in a somewhat distorted manner. The overriding sense now about this conflict in particular, this latest episode in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is there is a sense of victimhood. Both parties are claiming, if you like, that they are more victimized by this situation. And what this creates to the outside world, it's the sense that these people have to be pitied, and we have to take sides based not on political aspirations, say political aspirations of the Palestinian people for the right to self-determination or the political aspiration of Israel for security, but rather that it's a victimhood game, it's a pity game, and who's the party that lays more claim to that kind of thing then attracts more sympathy. We want to take this opportunity of this discussion to say what is the problem in that particular way that the kind of the conflict has been covered. What is wrong with saying it's about victimhood? What I would like to say is, if we look historically in the beginning, just to give you a glimpse, I guess, the conflict has been always played around, if you like, the Palestinian sense of self-determination in the past, led in one way or another to a recognition that there's a cause in there. At the same time, historically, which is something we cannot deny, there's a sentiment among Jewish people from different parts in the world for different historical reasons that they needed to have a country, if you like, where they can feel safe. And this is something that they would want to contest. But unfortunately, whereas these things in the past have led to the creation, for example, of Israel, an independent state, and a sense of struggle for the Palestinians about how they can claim back their rights, this seems to have disappeared today. This disappearance of a healthy sense of politics is what leads us to the situation we are in today. First of all, the Israelis, because they don't have a notion of how they want to organize their society politically and socially and interact with their neighbors according to a political platform, which used to be known as Zionism in the past. Because of the void and the disappearance of that thing, they tend to react more in this violent outburst that we see. At the same time, the use of violence by the Palestinians is not today aimed at a specific political target. It's not towards. In the past, you used to hear about the binational state. It's a state for Jews and Arabs together. That has disappeared altogether. So any sense of firing rockets and Operation Suicide Bombings does not actually mean that there's a fight for a specific political aim. It just seems to be saying, we're here, this is about a sense of identity rather than a political project. And across the divide, that is extremely an unhealthy situation that will lead to a further deterioration in the future. And we need to step back, and both parties need to step back from that and look at how they can overcome this paralysis, if you like, that's leading them to meaningless, bloody confrontation into something much more politically meaningful.
Can we just go back to the point you made about victimhood and saying there's one is seen as a victim and one as the perpetrator? Is that the point you're trying to make?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, if you look, for example, at Facebook updates, there was this thing that you can donate your Facebook update to either side, either to the Palestinian or the Israeli. And in the Palestinian side, there was this thing that 875 people killed today, 4,200 injured. And so it wasn't saying that this is a deep problematic problem that we are facing politically and we need your support and solidarity because these are our aims. It was just trying to say to you, And I admit it's catastrophic. A lot of people are dying. But just the pornography, if you like, of the obsession with the numbers is not a healthy way to understand that conflict. And you see then both parts started competing in the so-called propaganda and media war. And it's as if this is where the war is won, not on the battlefield. How can we prove to the outside world that we are the victims rather than we are people who have an aspiration that we need to fulfill?
In the sort of the most recent, what's just happened this month, the bombardments, it's definitely, I've sort of felt the media's given a very anti-Israeli look on it, and it's also seen Palestine as the victim in this case. And I've read a few things, and a lot of people seem to be saying that there's been an increase in anti-Semitism because of this. There's been like calls to boycott Jewish shops and stuff, and quite bad stuff. I mean, do you think that's something that anti-Semitism is something that's going to come back up into this sort of the whole role of it? Do you think that's going to?
I think there are worrying signs that anti-Semitism is on the rise, but not in the traditional forms that it used to exist in Europe, because those had different reasons in the past. What is happening today is precisely because the issues have become so clouded. People are just hitting back, if you like, without thinking about the consequences, without thinking about whether their actions are going to lead to any result. So, for example, if you talk about the boycotts, whether it's on either side, this is not really a way to change the world around you. It's just a way to make you feel better. And if you are, say, Jewish living in Europe or in America, or if you're an Arab living in Europe or in America, and you sort of stop going to Starbucks, then you feel a sense of accomplishment that is actually effectively on the ground, completely ineffective. Even if it were effective, even if the actions of consumers in the West and governments in the West were effective, I would even argue that against that kind of attitude, because, as I say, for Palestinians, and it should be for Jews as well, for everyone who lives in that area, their aim should be how to arrive at a society that everybody is equal in, how to arrive at self-determination, and not let that be dictated by foreign government or foreign consumers. I would be really worried if I got to the point where Western consumers can determine how my life is led anywhere in the world, not only in Palestine.
In a way, I feel like that's slightly an outdated idea, I think, because if we live in a global society now, and to suggest that we can go back to what sounded to me a very modern style of politics seems to be a little out of touch with the way that wars happen. I mean, consumer movements and consumer decisions do affect countries. I mean, let's just say Finland, Nokia is a huge percentage of their economy. If something happens to Nokia, Finland's in trouble. So, I mean, how do you propose that in such a global society we can go back to this almost modern local politics?
I would just contest the last bit that you said, in the sense that it's local. There's always, to any struggle, there is a global dimension. And this is something, if you think back of the Spanish Civil War, why would volunteers from Britain carry arms and go there to fight? And this is at the kind of the height of modern politics and anti-fascism. Why would they do that? They were not just sitting comfortably in their cafes over here saying, I'll drink fair trade coffee instead of drinking Starbucks. They actually felt that conflict meant so much to them for them to carry arms and go and fight. And there was enough of a political structure around to give them that opportunity. So I'm not saying this is a form of nostalgia to that. I'm saying if you wish to be engaged in a political struggle that does not actually touch your life on a daily basis, because let's face it, we're not Palestinians, we're not living in a refugee camp, or we're not Israelis in the middle of the... We were looking at it from a distance. I would say there's a place for solidarity. There's always place for solidarity. How that solidarity is orchestrated and how that solidarity becomes meaningful is a different thing. I would say in most forms of consumer boycotts and that sort of thing, it doesn't seem to me that the point is that it's healthy politically or kind of leading to change on the ground. It more seems to be about our own smugness, our own self-indulgence. And that's why I said as well, for your point, even if it were effective, I wouldn't want consumers in the West to be dictating the lifestyle and even the life itself of people somewhere else.
Don't you think that there's lack of leadership going on in the world right now on both sides, whether it's the Israelis or the Palestinians, in terms of the way they think, the way they're handling things. And also, if you look at international countries, Britain, like America, countries like America, the way they have handled. If you look at it, let's just say, if a smaller country like Somalia, if they were to attack and occupy another country, you'll have, in a minute, you'll have the UN, all the other countries bullying that, going to that country and basically, enforcing their power.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that it's not happening in Palestine, where you have this one side where they have big tanks with their big weapons and everything, and on the other side you have a group scattered all over the place, lack of leadership, and all we see is there is one power there, and that power is in control, and that's Israel. That's what I see at the moment.
Israel definitely has the military superiority. It has backing from the West. That's recognized. Everybody knows that. I would contest one thing you said, and when you said one which is in control. What I was trying to say in my introduction, that Israel is precisely today the opposite. It's in a state of lack of control. So you see, if you look at the actions of Israeli politicians over the last few years, and even a bit back from that, they have been characterized by a lack of sense of control. Israel came into being in very unique circumstances, and in response to, if you like, a particularly European problem. It came as a result or as a direct consequence of at the end of World War II, the Holocaust specifically. But it was, in a sense, a way of Europe to wash its hands of completely of the issue of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, all that kind of thing. It was the easy solution, but it was by no means the right solution. Instead of integrating Jewish Europeans into European societies, the opposite happened. They were sent away as if it's to kind of wipe over the problem and say this is not something that we have to deal with. And in that sense, Israel represented something important for the West then. It became, in the Cold War, in the kind of atmosphere of the conflict with the Soviet Union, it became a form of foothold in a world, in the Arab world, which could have at any point taken the sides of the Soviets. That kind of framework starts to disappear from the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s. And then Israel itself is in a big crisis, because with the lack of the clarity of its relationship with the West, in parallel, a deterioration in what Zionism itself means. It was always about that this is a haven for Jews to be sheltered from all the problems they were facing in the past, which didn't actually play out like that. It actually instead became, in the words of a famous revolutionary, Leon Trotsky, became a bloody trap for the Jews from all over the world. So the dream of security for Jews didn't materialize. We arrive today at a sense where Israeli society has this big crisis. It's generally it's called as post-Zionism now. So there's a sense there isn't this big dream, this political ideal that will unify the society and give it meaning. But at the same time, it still has the military superiority. And the problem then is, without that sense of purpose and without the sense that you fight wars in order to fulfill a specific political aim, Israel is becoming more and more lacking in control. And that's why you see this very violent eruptions.
And if you look at the Palestinian government now, they might say they have a government, but really they don't have that sense of a structure. Their structure is breaking down. When the border was opened to Egypt, half of the population of Gaza crossed to the other side, just to get food supplies. If a government cannot provide for their people, then they're not a government really. What we are seeing is that injustice. On the other side, you also have ignorant people going about blowing themselves up for the wrong reasons. I think that's not going to solve anything. But the point I'm trying to make here is one has the upper hand.
There is an acute sense of injustice, and I get that. What I'm trying to avoid falling into is this trap of then just because one side is militarily stronger than the other, then they necessarily have to be looked at as victims. in my past politically, I've been quite involved in pro-Palestinian organizations, and I still count myself as a supporter of the Palestinian cause. By no means I would go and tell a Palestinian man or woman how to dictate their kind of develop their political future or anything like that, but I consider myself a supporter of that. Unfortunately, what seems to be happening today is, whereas in the past the Palestinian liberation movement was about self-determination, it wasn't about the appeal to anyone in the world to come and solve the situation for them. And unfortunately, this is something that's happening now. So we've heard a lot of Palestinian politicians saying, how about deployment of UN troops? How about the West intervening? As you were saying, if anything happened anywhere in the world, the West would interfere. That's very problematic. If anything, the struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis have been made compounded and made even worse because of Western intervention. It's never helped. So what I'm trying to say, it seems it's really horrific, it's really barbaric sometimes what we see on the screens, but we have to avoid this sense that the sense of urgency that comes every couple of years from these encounters is we've forgotten about it for 2 years, we don't have to think about politics, we don't think about that part of the world, and then suddenly something happens and then we need a solution now. It doesn't happen like that. We need to rebuild that sense that this is a struggle for self-determination and equality, and definitely, I wouldn't say that's something that's going to be solved by the United Nations or the West. If anything, we need to oppose Western intervention in there. And this is more the part that we can play in our societies here in the West.
So right now we've been talking about the problems a lot, but to progress towards a solution, you point out that the fact Israel, or a lot of commentators saying Israel is currently lashing out right now because it feels insecure. So what actions are there that can be taken by the international community to, make it feel more secure? Or should the international community even do anything? Is this something that just Israel can only take care of domestically through the building of coalitions and, through the election of a new prime minister? What can be done so there's more security in the area?
That's ultimately up to Israelis themselves and up to Israeli society. And this is precisely the point that I was trying to make. And you can't write a formula for these things, and you can't ask international community to interfere in order to correct these historic problems. Just think back and look at history and see, has there ever been any instances of a sort of benign intervention that yielded results anywhere in the world? I don't think so, and I think there's always narrow political calculations that play their role. But what I would say for Israel, if you like, to arrive at this security, it needs to answer more basic questions. Can you justify in the 21st century a state that has very, if you like, ambiguous boundaries? Mm-hmm. This is the biggest problem in Israel today. Nobody knows where its boundaries are. As in, does it include the millions of Palestinians that live in the territories under their control or not? And if not, does it want to have a state only for the Jews and dismiss all these other parties or not? And I'm not saying this to say this is blame on one part or the other, but there's a nature of a society that came into being as a result of a big problem in Europe and was exported to that part of the world. And the solution now, having generations of Jews have been born in Israel, so anybody who would say the solution is to send them all back to Europe is completely deluded, and it's something I will never agree with. The solution is, how can Arabs and Jews from both sides work towards a state, if you like, or a form of government in which there is equality, there is a secular society in which people can practice, if you like, their religion or not any religion whatsoever, and feel equal and feel as if they're part of that society. And these are things that are not solved by the election of a prime minister. It's about, again, discovering that sense of politics, that it's not about this periodic, let's show strength, let's be macho about it. That doesn't work. I wouldn't say you shouldn't use violence in any political cause, not at all. Violence sometimes achieves results, but it needs to be put to a specific political purpose. And if I ask today, and we can all ask ourselves this, what are both sides in the conflict today achieving by this use of violence? Nothing.
If you look more specifically at the outcome of World War II and the assault of the fascist regime at the time, is sort of continued on into the legacy of how the Israeli military and the Israeli politicians function in a way. It's become very fascist, in my opinion, and I think in maybe a lot of other people's opinions, the situation has come to that of a genocide, in fact, or close to. And I'm sort of curious about your thoughts about the sort of eugenics of the situation, like about the sort of cultural cleansing of different tribes and different races. That I sort of see it in this perspective, like it's almost like the peace treaty is just an illusion. It's not like something that's ever due to be achieved. It's just something to sort of distract the attention of the public in order to basically annihilate a whole race in the meantime.
I think we have to be very precise. There's always a danger in getting carried away with analogies that are not quite precise on the ground. And this is not by way of taking sides. As I say, I consider myself a supporter of Palestine and the Palestinian cause. But calling, for example, the Israeli leadership fascist is somehow erroneous. And again, this is not in their defense, because fascist societies are characterized by certain characteristics that you don't actually find in Israel. Equally, talking about genocide or comparing that to the Holocaust is not productive, and it's not by any means by way of defending them. It's more, if you want to get more out of understanding of the conflict, you have to be really objective, and you have to understand what happens over there. So it's a very kind of brutal situation, absolutely. It's not genocide, and this is not just a linguistic game. Because if we get carried away and we sort of raise the tone of the accusation rather than the understanding, then there's absolutely no way that we're going to get a grasp on it. I would say, let's try to understand how this violence is happening and why it's happening. And I would say absolutely the Israeli society as a whole, not just leadership, has been showing a lot of disregard for the lives of Palestinians. And you could probably say the opposite as well. And I mean, I don't want to get into these discussions. But that doesn't translate into saying this is about fascism or genocide or anything like that. This is precisely a violence that comes out of a complete lack of any sense of control or lacking any political project on the ground. Because if you say, what is Israel trying to achieve by that? Let's ask that question. What does it try to achieve by the deployment of this extreme violence? If we're saying it's like the ethnic cleansing, then you would say, well, their biggest problem would be the Arabs that are actually within Israel itself, not the Arabs outside. Because they can simply, and they've started doing that, just build a wall and say, let's leave these people to their own affairs and let them manage, and we don't care about that. And in a sense, Israeli kind of politics is in such a state of bankruptcy that it's effectively doing that. It's just completely building a wall between itself and the Palestinians so as not to have to deal with that issue. But the other side of the coin is within Israel itself, what it considers to be Israel proper. Today, the Arab population is roughly 20%. They do not feel part of Israeli society. Their language is not spoken. They can't get jobs like Jewish kind of citizens of Israel. There's all sorts of things. But they are by no means under pressure to kind of leave the country or being subjected to violence or anything like that. So in order to be more accurate, I would say there's a situation in which there's injustice, there's inequality, and the solution is definitely not to compound the issues by kind of comparing it with misleading analogies from the past, but to understand the specific dynamics of that. And what I would like to say is what I said in my introduction, is this sense of lack of self-control, lack of a political platform, that politics is what I have to do every day, how I shape my life, how I want my society to be. It's all these questions, and it takes effort from everyone to keep answering these questions every day. We can't just sit back and go and vote once in every 4 years and hope for things to turn out for the better. So that's the kind of sense that I feel is much more needed than that sense of exaggeration.
Speaking of the genocide issue, one thing I find interesting with that is it seems to be almost a way for the Western media to kind of produce a pseudo-insightful analysis of the situation, because it always has like a sort of poetic ring to it, kind of the victims then become the Nazis. And there's a sense also that ties in with the competitive victimhood you were talking about as well, I think, in that both sides want to make claim to the genocide victim status. So you'll get people who support the Israelis. If quite often I find that when their views are criticised, they respond to it saying that's anti-Semitic, you can't criticise us for that reason, which is nonsense, obviously. And then, but similarly, Palestinian protesters are kind of encouraging the labelling of the Gaza situation as a genocide, or comparison to, say, the Warsaw Ghetto, which seem to be circulating also at the moment. And I think it does tie into what you're saying.
We've been talking a lot about sort of the problems in Palestine and Israel in our discussion right now, and all the problems with the way that we interpret those problems, etc. And I just want to sort of ask or comment on two things. Maddie mentioned earlier about anti-Semitism today, and you said it's different to in the past, etc. And a lot of people today will say, actually, we're anti-Zionists, we're not anti-Semites, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But what I think is interesting, if we go back to the protest, for example, in London just a few weeks ago, a lot of the anti-Israel protesters, they come from, they range from people like the socialists, the left, Islamic fundamentalists, and all these kind of really different range of groups, and so you want to know inside your head, what do these people have in common? And one of the things they have in common is they're, quite disillusioned about modernity and the future and all that kind of stuff. And also, just going back to what Mike said earlier about sort of the boycott of Starbucks, or, that whole thing. You had the destruction of the Starbucks in Kensington a couple of weeks ago as well, which is, it's quite a big reaction. But it's also a lot wider than that, and it's general. There's these emails and text messages and all of that going all across the globe amongst these networks that boycott Starbucks because they directly fund the Israeli military. So if you go there, you're supporting that. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because that came out of a myth in the sense that a rumor, about this guy who wrote a spoof. Saying that the CEO of Starbucks is directly funding, and he actually admitted that this was just a spoof, this is not true, but it has spread like wildfire, to the point where you get these outrages like the destruction of Starbucks in Kensington and the whole boycott and all that kind of stuff. So what I want to know is, in terms of the international community and our reaction to this problem, what do you think is behind these reactions? Because they seem quite irrational when you think about them, So what do you think is the reason behind it?
I think there's something very crucial that you said. So I suspect you probably know the answer more than I do. You said it's a bit, there's something anti-modern about it, and there's this trend towards being driven by sensitivities of that. The world around us is changing, and we've carried on for too far, and maybe we should kind of slow down a little bit. And it's something everybody feels everywhere now, and it's gaining a lot of momentum. And it manifests itself in different things, surely for politics, but also in the attitude towards the environment and all these sorts of things, where we see, if you like, a universal now, almost universal rejection of the values of modernity and progress. And in a sense, the way you actually look at it closely in modernity, and I think back to what Mike, you said originally, and you almost meant it as a critique, that it's a way of returning to modern politics. I don't want to say it was the good olden days, but in that era of history that we generally consider to be modernity, the politics of self-determination was much more active than today. And in a sense, this rainbow coalition, if you like, is not cheerful as that. There's some nasty characters in that, but one thing you have to say is you have to respect that people, first of all, feel something and they want to do something about it. And the fact if you have a coalition in itself is not necessarily a problem. It's just that the unique nature of all these partners in that coalition is a bit baffling. I, as an old leftist, who found it very strange to be in the same kind of movement with radical Islamists. So in a sense, it seems to be more about an opportunity to let off steam about all this frustration with the world around us. And it's not necessarily about a specific political aim that we want to take out of it. Maybe it's a nice day out, hundreds of thousands of people, and it's an opportunity for us to register that we're feeling frustrated with. And in a sense, it becomes like a tantrum. But it's based on the lowest common denominator. And in a sense, Israel has come to represent what we always urge in the Arab left, and this is kind of my own personal history, is Israel was very successful as a country in terms of industry, in terms of agriculture, in terms of all of these things. And there's a lesson to be learned there. There's a lesson in how development can actually increase the capacity of a specific geographic area of land to accommodate its people and give them a decent life standard. Regardless of our objections towards its foundations, it was very successful. In that sense, it represented a kind of an achievement in modern terms. And in a sense, today, the people who are criticizing it, they are criticizing also that very modern aspect of it. And it's not by accident that a lot of, within Israel itself, a lot of the opposition to the, if you like, the political status quo comes from very environmental kind of background. And there's even the whole notion that the more important aspect now, and this is seriously being developed, of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis is a resource issue. It's not actually about competing political projects, all of which is completely irrelevant. But what it tells is that this notion that there's so much about our apathy towards modernity, our lack of appetite to say that the world around us is not for us to sit back and wait for things to happen. The world is opportunities. It's about development. It's about progress. And that's how, in a sense, the Palestinians are becoming the darlings of the international left, or, if you like, liberals in general, because they're often portrayed as vernacular, kind of living in vernacular settings, happy just planting, feeding their goats and planting their fields and living this pre-modern ideal kind of existence, and which suddenly gets invaded by a modern European invader. And that's completely inaccurate. The Palestinian liberation movement was all about how can we develop, if you like, the Palestinian state, which will come into being and make it a more rewarding place to, and how to be more progressive. So in a sense, this, if you like, a return to the ideals, the modern ideals that informed that Palestinian political struggle for so long, is one way from the Palestinian point of view of overcoming the obstacles of how they are being portrayed today. But at the same time, we need to do, I think, from our point of view here, more work to inform those protesters, and maybe to make use of that energy, that sense of frustration, to say there are much more intelligent ways of directing that and putting it to use than going and smashing up a Starbucks. I don't find that necessarily healthy or useful to anyone. And for example, I know from the country that I come from, in Lebanon, that Starbucks employs hundreds of people over there, and it's actually a local franchise is operated by local investors. So actually, when these places are attacked or smashed up, it's always the local partners that get hurt, and it's never the franchise owners. So there's some work to be done towards dispelling these myths. I particularly don't like Starbucks, but not because of their politics, because their coffee is rubbish. But that's something different. I wouldn't go and smash it up. And then the other point that I want to make is that energy, the fact that you would get off your ass on a Sunday or Saturday and go to a demonstration, is not to be dismissed, because these are not the majority, they are the minority. There's a lot of work to be done by saying a sense of solidarity is healthy, but how about looking at it? What is more politically effective? And how do you reflect on that with regard to your life? Don't look at the Palestinians as if they are these pre-modern kind of alien creatures to you. They are human beings like you and I who want to have a better future for themselves, and they have every right to. Then you can ask yourself questions about how you can feed into that, or actually if you have any role whatsoever. But I wouldn't be at all dismissive of, if you like, the instinct to want to do something. That's a very noble thing. It's just a question for us. How do we do that?
Yes, I was wondering if you had any, proposals for that, because, like you said, the overall sense of feeling is everyone's very frustrated right now. The West, Israel, Palestine, And you said that there's much more intelligent things to do than be smashing up Starbucks. But what exactly are these opportunities? I mean, it seems right now the two choices we have, neither are very appealing, are you intervene and everyone's screwed, or you don't intervene and everyone's screwed too. I mean,
How do you
what
channel
options
the
are there?
energy to do something with what's out there?
And what do they want to do? I mean, we're all sort of imposing our ideas of what we think is best for the region, but I know that also Lebanon and Israel's history is a very tense one as well. And from, perhaps this is a bit, simplistic, I know that we'd all like to see peace, but is it really possible for them all to, live together, considering the history behind them, considering the religious conflicts, the cultural conflicts? From what I understand, is it possible for Arabs and Jews to live together?
There's a lot of Jewish people that live in the Middle East and they live with Arabs. Their neighbours are Arabs, and that was the case. And the only picture that we're seeing is the thing that's happening in Palestine and in Israel at the moment, and that is the only picture that we get when we think of Arabs and Jewish.
In the 90s, that inspired the whole this Western peace process. It didn't work. Basically, it was that Westerners didn't believe that Arabs and Jews could live together, so we just cut down right down the middle, segregated them, and they couldn't mix. And that's what's led to how it is now.
But do they want that? Is that what they want?
Well, separation obviously hasn't worked, and what separation
Take a
is
back seat,
integration.
It's true what Hamza's saying. They've been living together for centuries, all over the Middle East. Even in Egypt, there's a big diversity between Christian and a Jewish and a Muslim population. I mean, even Arabs themselves, it's not as simple just to say Jews and Arabs, because even Arabs themselves is a racial identity. It's not a belief system. So even Arabs can be Jewish or Christian or as such, so
As can Westerners.
as can be Semites, so even Arabs are Semites, so to even raise the argument of anti-Semitism is a bit redundant in a way, so.
I think it's almost giving up to say that because, well, I don't know, kind of treating them as sort of a special case. Arabs and Jews can never possibly get along. I mean, there's cases around the world where people have been in conflict for centuries, like in Europe. I mean, England and France have a long history of wars. If we got over that, you don't hate French people. I mean, I hope you don't anyway. I mean, it just seems really stupid to me to suggest that this is a special case and they could never possibly ever get along, and therefore we have to segregate them. I mean, people do get over acrimonious history. It's just that the current policies seem to want to fix that history in
place. I just really
place.
want to interrupt at this point because of we keep going back to this. They're identified as pre-modern. They're identified as modern. The fact that it is different to all of that now because it is not modern. It is not pre-modern. It is postmodern. We are living in an age when even Westerners are Arabs. They are Jews. We are not talking about people who are detached from an issue or who could intervene or take a back seat. These are people who are genuinely connected to the issues, who may know people who are out there, who may have friends and family out there. We live in a global society, and I think that a more positive way to discuss things, instead of these sweeping solutions or this blame game, which is even being played with the West here, blaming the West for everything, is completely unproductive when there really is so much positive energy going towards it. People are genuinely frustrated by these issues and genuinely want to feed into it. And I mean, a perfect example of why this makes it very difficult to solve is terrorism. We've ignored terrorism for almost this entire discussion, which is very strange, and we've talked about consumerism, which is almost the flip side. It's an individual who takes a strong interest in a situation and acts, and terrorism is just a channeling of that, but it's a channeling of that is unproductive to a modern political system. So how do we channel it in a way that combats or is more, or at least more productive than terrorism?
One of the problems in the past, especially since 9/11, is that terrorism has become a category on its own. So we had the war on terrorism. It just seems to me the most ludicrous thing in the universe.
Yeah.
It's almost saying it's the war on Christmas, or what does the war on terrorism mean? Because that means you've completely evacuated that act of violence from any political sense. And I don't understand, and a lot of us need to appreciate that a lot of the actions that we've seen in the past few years have been completely sort of voided out from any political possibility. So when Al-Qaeda does an operation, it's more about a spectacle. It's an end in of itself. You can't go and say to Al-Qaeda, okay, what is your political program? How are we going to negotiate with you? Because you're not going to get an answer that is impossible to deal with. But at the same time, we conceptually, to accept that terrorism sort of exists on its own, or it's like a form of a hobby or something like that that people can engage in, there's a conceptual problem in that. We need to understand that there are actions of violence that are politically motivated, and sometimes they have a sense of purpose to them, sometimes they don't. But to sort of isolate it from that, then you get into that game that you wanted to avoid, whether you call it state terrorism or all these sort of categories. What I want to say is that violence kind of in a political context? Does it operate in a political context? Is it trying to achieve an aim, or is it just confusing the issues? Where does it come from? That's what we need to be thinking about more.
Then surely should we not go back to the old ways of fighting then? Advancement of technology is very powerful weaponry we see. Like, we have seen what happened in Hiroshima, we have seen all that stuff. What I'm saying is, like, should we not change the rules of war itself? Because all we see is, we don't see soldiers fighting, we see innocent civilians, whether it's also on the Israeli side or the Palestinian side. Children, women dying every day.
There is something dangerous about us saying technology is getting out of control and it's causing all these problems, because ultimately it's who deploys the weapons, who takes the decisions, and that's what we need to be worrying about. You know, we live in a world where post-Hiroshima, post-Holocaust, the immediate response to that was that this is modernity has brought this about. And that was completely wrong. We need to understand that. Unfortunately, we live in a world that lives on this legacy. There are French writers and philosophers that made the whole career of just saying modernity is bad and this is what's caused all of that, as if kind of denouncing any sense of agency. Denouncing the very possibility that human beings can make decisions and make choices. And if you start with that, that's really basic. That sense of we are the ones in control. We are the ones, all this machinery doesn't do war on its own.
But I mean, like, how do we decide who answers those questions? Because if there's such a mixture, I mean, what would you say a society is? I mean, why do we still stick to national borders, for example?
Sovereignty is a very important thing. And sovereignty, before it even comes to the question of are you living in a kingdom or a republic, or before you realize that these are the boundaries of the society that you can engage in politics in, and this is up to you to determine how it is shaped and develops over time and all that kind of thing, you have to recognize the notion of sovereignty, which is extremely under attack today. This is the limits of your world, if you like. Now, there's nothing that says we shouldn't be global in outlook or if you like, have the sense of solidarity and all that kind of thing. What's more important is what touches on your life over here. Now, you can always feel a kind of a sense of injustice or something like this that says, I need to do something about it. But you need to respect the opinions and the will of the people who live there. And unfortunately, and this is something that you mentioned earlier, that we all project on the Palestinians and the Israelis today. We all want to come up with these neat little solutions. Federalism, two-state, one-state, all these kind of variations. This is all irrelevant. If we want to do something about it, we need to understand the role that our governments are playing.
So can you explain more what that role of our government is?
When the war on Iraq happened, why didn't we manage to stop that war? Did we want that war to happen? Did the majority of people want that war to happen? Why do we still live in a society where our governments can wage completely meaningless wars, completely destructive wars, and kind of get away with that? And I understand there were a lot of big demonstrations. Mm-hmm. Let's reflect back on it a little bit, because it's similar to what's happening now. What were the aims of these demonstrations? Did they have a very clear political aim? Did they want to kind of say no to your right to launch war in kind of without any political justification? No, it was a completely almost out of moral repulsiveness, but not out of any sense of wanting to challenge the system. I would have, if we had lived in other times, we would have said, this is horrendous. We need to go out there and change the whole system. But this is not for us just to complain about on Saturday and then forget about it until the next struggle. It means that every single one of us needs to be engaged in a way and radically challenging this system. And there we say it, the word revolution. I mean, you're all young people, full of energy.
Well, that seems a good place to leave it. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but I'd just like to say a big thank you to Karl and to our World Bites volunteers. You've been watching Don't Shout the Telly, Change the Message on it. And in that spirit, if you'd like to let us know what you think on any of the issues raised here or in the programme, just click on Viewers Bite Back. And if you want to get involved in World Bites and be on the panel next time, please get in touch.